I never would have guessed that accepting a simple ride from the gardener would leave a mark on me, deeper than the sunburn on my shoulders that afternoon. All I had wanted was a lift back from the vast estate I'd spent the morning inspecting, a property so expansive that its winding gardens had long ago become part of my rhythm, as familiar as my first cup of coffee. The roses, the hydrangeas, the gravel paths curving out of sight, they were routine, predictable, safe. Michael was not. There was something about him that unsettled me in a quiet way. Not alarming, never that. It was subtler. A presence that didn't push forward, didn't demand notice, yet somehow anchored the space around him. The kind of man who could stand silently in a room and still alter its atmosphere. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, he was the wronger. Strong hands, steady work, a man accustomed to soil and seasons. And yet, that day, he revealed a strength that had little to do with muscle and everything to do with something far more intimate. Before I go on, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share in the comments which city you're listening from. Your support means more than you know. And now let me take you back to that afternoon. The sun had been merciless. By late morning, it hung overhead like an unblinking eye. I had wandered too long among the flower beds, brushing my fingers across velvet petals, pausing more often than I used to. Soil clung to my palms. Dry leaves speckled my sweater. At my age, warmth seeps deeper. It doesn't just touch a skin, it settles into the bones. I could feel fatigue creeping in. Quiet but persistent. Earlier, I had asked Michael if he might drive me back into town once he finished trimming the eastern hedge. It seemed like a practical arrangement. I imagined a brief ride in his truck, a few polite exchanges about the weather. Perhaps a remark about the stubbornness of this year's blooms. He would drop me at the corner near the main road, and that would be that. A small favor. Quickly forgotten. I did not anticipate that something in that short drive would shift the way I saw him, or myself. He arrived precisely when he said he would. No rush, no apology. Just punctuality that felt less like obligation and more like quiet respect. He brushed his hands against his jeans as I approached. Streaks of earth marking the denim like badges of honest labor. When he smiled, it wasn't broad or performative. It was measured, genuine. The kind of smile that reaches you slowly. Standing near him, I felt something unexpected steadiness. As if the noise of the world, its chaos, its constant urgency, paused in his orbit. I realized then that strength isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's simply the absence of turmoil. Ready? He asked. His voice was low, even carrying no trace of impatience. There was no showmanship in him. No need to impress. Just a calm assurance that whatever task lay before him, whether pruning roses or driving an aging woman back to town, would be handled with care. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. A ride, yes. But beneath that something else stirred. A quiet curiosity, a sense that this man, who spent his days coaxing life from soil, carried stories beneath the surface, stories shaped by endurance, by loss, perhaps even by love. As I stepped toward the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that this ordinary afternoon was inching toward something quietly profound. And I had no idea yet how much that short drive would reveal, not about him, but about the fragile, hidden parts of myself I thought had long since settled into silence. Yes, I answered, my voice softer than I intended as I fumbled with the clasp of my purse. I'm ready. The words felt simple, but as I climbed into the passenger seat, I became aware of something shifting inside me. It wasn't discomfort. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet electricity of proximity, the awareness of another person's warmth in a space small enough to hold it. The door shut with a solid thud, sealing us inside a world that suddenly felt narrower, more intimate. The truck carried the faint scent of turned soil and worn leather. It wasn't cologne or polish, it was honest. Earthy. The kind of smell that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Strangely, it steadied me. As though if the world outside blurred or tilted, this cabin could hold us firmly in place. For a while we drove without speaking. The tires crunched along the gravel driveway, the engine humming low and constant. Somewhere in the distance, birds called to one another, their sharp notes cutting through the quiet. I watched Michael guide the truck through the familiar curves of the property. There was no hesitation in his movements. He handled the wheel with the assurance of someone who knew every bend, every dip, every uneven patch of ground. Through the sleeves of his faded flannel, I could see the quiet definition of his arms as he shifted gears and adjusted the steering wheel. It struck me then, not with surprise, but with recognition, that his strength went beyond the obvious. Yes, there was physical capability there. But more than that, there was restraint control. A grounded confidence that didn't need to prove itself. He occupied space without overpowering it. Before I realized what I was doing, I began talking. About the morning light resting on the rose petals, about how the hydrangeas had bloomed earlier this year. About how the scent of damp earth had carried me back decades to my childhood garden. The memories slipped out easily, as though they had been waiting for an audience patient enough to receive them. And Michael listened. Not the distracted kind of listening that people perform out of politeness. He didn't interrupt. Didn't rush to respond. His eyes stayed on the road. But there was an attentiveness in the angle of his head, in the quiet nods he offered, that made me feel unmistakably heard. It was a peculiar sensation, to feel seen without being stared at. His attention didn't press against me. It wrapped around me, steady and warm. The driveway narrowed before opening toward the main road. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, how deceptively ordinary. Then the truck dipped suddenly into a shallow rut in the gravel. It wasn't dramatic. Just enough to jolt me forward. My balance faltered, and instinctively, my hand reached out, landing against his arm. Solid. Warm. Real. His grip on the wheel never wavered, he didn't flinch, didn't tense. For a fraction of a second. Time seemed to thin, stretching quietly between us. My fingers rested there longer than necessary. Aware of the steady strength beneath the fabric of his sleeve. He could have shifted away. Could have made light of it. Could have filled the space with a joke. He didn't. Instead, he allowed the moment to exist without commentary. Without performance. There was no smirk, no teasing remark, no attempt to turn it into something it wasn't. Just a subtle stillness, a shared breath suspended in the cabin. And that, more than anything, unsettled me. Because in that silence, I felt something deeper than attraction. I felt trust. A sense that if I were to lose my footing, not just in a truck on a gravel road, but in the more fragile places of life, this was a man who would not panic. Who would not withdraw. The truck leveled out. My hand slowly returned to my lap, but the air between us had changed. Not charged in an obvious way. Not reckless, just quietly aware. As though something unspoken had stepped into the space beside us, riding along toward the main road, waiting. A warmth unfurled inside me then, quiet and steady. And it had nothing to do with the sun filtering through the windshield. It was subtler than that. And inward, though I hadn't realized I needed. I became aware of details I might once have overlooked. The unwavering steadiness of his hands on the wheel. The composed focus in his eyes. The way his shoulders remained relaxed even as the road curved unpredictably ahead. There was power in him. Not the kind that announces itself. Not the kind that demands to be admired. His strength was restrained, almost protective in nature. Like a shelter built without ever boasting about its walls. He moved through the world with a quiet assurance that didn't seek permission and didn't require applause. Our conversation shifted gently as we drove. The topics were ordinary: weather patterns, the stubborn bloom of late roses, the little bakery near the town square I'd always favored. Yet beneath those simple exchanges ran something deeper. An undercurrent. We weren't trying to impress one another. There were no rehearsed lines, no careful performances, just presence, two people occupying the same space without strain, and that presence felt rare. By the time the first buildings of town appeared in the distance, I felt something unexpected tightening in my chest, a reluctance. It seemed foolish. It was only a ride. A short stretch of road between an estate and a familiar corner. Yet I wasn't ready for it to end. Because somewhere along that gravel path and winding driveway, I had felt seen. Not admired. Seen in recent years. I had grown accustomed to invisibility, the quiet kind that arrives with age. That slips over you gradually until you realize people speak around you instead of to you. But sitting there beside Michael, I had not felt diminished. His attention, so calm and unforced, had acknowledged me without reducing me. It struck me then strength is often misunderstood. We mistake volume for authority, dominance for security. But true strength can be patient, gentle. It can exist in the space someone holds without filling it with themselves. As he slowed near the edge of town, I felt the moment settling into memory even before it ended. What had begun as a practical favor had shifted into something quietly transformative. A revelation about connection, about trust, about how unexpectedly another human being can alter the rhythm of your heart without ever intending to. When I stepped out of the truck, the world seemed slightly louder than before. The next few days carried on as usual, yet something in me had changed. I found my thoughts drifting back to that drive more often than I cared to admit. It wasn't merely the closeness or the awareness of his physical presence. It was the calm he seemed to generate, as if time itself had slowed while we sat in that cabin. As if the noise of life had softened just enough for me to breathe deeply again. I caught myself glancing at my calendar, scanning for excuses to return to the property. For inspections that could have waited. For tasks that suddenly felt urgent. I told myself it was coincidence, professional responsibility. But hope, I realized, has a quiet way of disguising itself as routine. That Saturday morning, after far too much internal debate, I made a decision that surprised even me. Nothing elaborate, nothing improper, just tea, simple, civil. Yet my pulse betrayed the truth as I rehearsed the invitation in my mind. Because somewhere beneath the courtesy, beneath the surface politeness, I knew I wasn't merely offering him a cup of tea. I was offering him the chance to step beyond the edges of that truck. And perhaps without fully admitting it, I was hoping he would. A brief pause in his work, that's all I told myself it would be. Just tea, just conversation. Yet beneath that reasonable explanation was a quieter truth. I wanted to feel that steadiness again. I needed to know whether the connection in that truck had been a trick of sunlight and proximity, or something real. When he arrived, he didn't hesitate at the doorway. No awkward shifting of weight. No restless scanning of the room. Michael stepped inside as though he belonged wherever he chose to stand. There was soil still dusted along the edges of his hands, the faint scent of the garden clinging to him, and when his eyes found mine, they warmed in a way that felt unforced. "Mary," he said gently, almost amused, "you didn't have to invite me. I was just coming," I began, then stopped myself with a small smile. He laughed softly, a low, unhurried sound that settled into the room like sunlight. "I suppose I was," he admitted. "But I'm glad you did." There was no bravado in him. No need to posture. He didn't make the invitation heavier than it was. Yet the air between us carried a quiet awareness neither of us acknowledged aloud. We moved to the living room. Cups of tea warming our hands. Afternoon light streamed through the curtains, casting delicate patterns across the walls and the worn edges of the furniture. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of gold, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, the room felt different with him in it, fuller. Grounded. For the first time in years, I felt entirely at ease sharing silence with someone. Michael had an unassuming presence, but it sharpened your senses. I found myself noticing the smallest things. The way he cradled the porcelain cup carefully, as if mindful of its fragility. The way his gaze followed the sunlight across the wooden floor, the quiet patience in his posture he listened. We spoke of simple matters at first, work. The stubborn ivy creeping along the back fence, the unpredictability of spring rains. But gradually, without either of us pushing, the conversation deepened. I told him about my childhood garden, the rows of marigolds my mother planted every April. The way my father used to whistle while watering the lawn. I spoke of my late husband, of how he once insisted that roses responded better to conversation than fertilizer. I hadn't shared those memories aloud in years. They had lived inside me like pressed flowers between the pages of a closed book. And then, almost without meaning to, I confessed something quieter. The emptiness, the subtle hush that had settled over my days since I'd been alone. Not dramatic loneliness, not despair. Just the steady absence of being witnessed. Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fill the silence with comfort or solutions. He simply listened. His attention was steady and undivided, and in that attentiveness, I felt something stir. Something fragile and long dormant. To be heard without being hurried is a rare gift. Then it happened. I reached for the sugar bowl, misjudging the distance slightly. At the same moment, his hand moved toward it. Our fingers brushed briefly, softly. An accidental touch. And yet it lingered, not physically. Our hands did not remain entwined. But something in the air shifted, tightened. A subtle charge threaded through the space, delicate but undeniable. I felt my breath catch. Michael looked up slowly, meeting my eyes. His expression didn't change dramatically. There was no shock, no fluster, just awareness. A quiet recognition that he had felt it too. He didn't pull away abruptly. He didn't retreat into politeness. He allowed the moment to exist. In that suspended second, the room seemed to narrow again, just as the truck had days earlier. The sunlight, the ticking clock. The distant hum of the world beyond my windows, all of it faded to the background. And what unsettled me most was not the touch itself. It was the realization that I wanted it to mean something. Instead, he offered the smallest nod, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't encouragement. It was acknowledgement. A silent agreement that the moment existed, and that it didn't need to be dissected. That was when I saw it clearly again. His strength wasn't in the obvious places. Yes, his hands were capable. Yes, his shoulders carried weight with ease. But the deeper strength, the rarer kind, was restraint. The patience to let a moment breathe. The discipline to honor a boundary without retreating from connection. He held his presence steady, protective without possession, attentive without intrusion. And in that balance, I felt safe. Not swept away, not overwhelmed. Safe. It startled me how quickly that sense of security settled into my bones. I realized then that what made him powerful wasn't dominance. It was reliability. The quiet certainty that he would not mishandle what was fragile. After we finished our tea, we stepped into the garden. The afternoon air had softened, carrying the scent of warm earth and petals beginning to close for the evening. Michael crouched beside the rosebush I'd been struggling with for weeks. I watched him carefully as he examined the stems. He didn't rush. He studied the plant as if it were something living in more ways than one. His fingers traced along a thorned branch, identifying where to cut. When he finally pruned, the motion was deliberate and precise. Confident, yet gentle. It struck me how similar it was to the way he handled silence. On impulse, perhaps emboldened by the ease growing between us, I asked if he might help me move a heavy stone planter near the patio. I had tried earlier in the week and failed, frustrated by my own limitations. He looked at it, then at me and smiled. Not smug, not theatrical, just knowing. In one fluid motion, he bent, adjusted his grip, and lifted the planter as though it weighed nothing at all. The effort showed in his forearms, but there was no strain in his expression. He set it down exactly where I'd imagined it should go. I felt a surprising rush of delight, almost laughter bubbling up inside me. It wasn't simply admiration for physical strength. It was the deeper recognition of capability. Of steadiness. The understanding that if something felt heavy, physically or otherwise, he would not panic beneath it. There was reassurance in that. A kind of grounding that reached further than I wanted to admit. We spent the remainder of the afternoon tending the garden together. Our movements began to synchronize without discussion. He steadied branches while I trimmed. I fetched tools before he asked. At one point, we both reached for the watering can and laughed softly at our mirrored instinct. The laughter felt easy. Earned. Between stories about stubborn weeds and unpredictable seasons, there were stretches of silence that didn't demand filling. Silence that felt companionable rather than empty. With each passing minute, I became more aware of the layers within him. The quiet humor tucked behind his calm demeanor. The patience that seemed endless. The unwavering composure that never tipped into coldness. And somewhere in those shared hours, something in me loosened. The sun began its slow descent, washing the sky in hues of amber and rose. Shadows stretched long across the grass. The garden, once bright and bustling, grew softer, intimate in the fading light. Michael straightened, brushing his hands together lightly. Then he looked at me. His eyes caught the gold of the evening, reflecting it back in a way that made the moment feel suspended in time. There was no urgency in his gaze, no demand, just warmth. And standing there beneath the quiet sky, surrounded by roses that had witnessed more seasons than I could count, I felt the undeniable truth settling gently inside me. This was no longer just about a ride. It was about trust forming in the most unexpected place. About strength expressed not in force, but in care. And about the fragile, hopeful realization that even after loss, after years of quiet solitude, the heart can still recognize something steady when it finds it. The last light of evening rested softly across his face as he looked at me. "You know," he said, his voice low, almost contemplative, "I didn't expect to enjoy this as much as I do. Just being here. Helping, talking, it feels good." There was no grand confession in his tone, no dramatic weight. Just honesty. I felt that warmth again, deeper this time. "Steady or feel the same," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The garden had quieted around us. Leaves rustled faintly in the cooling breeze. And somewhere in the distance a bird called out before settling for the night. It felt as though the world had stepped back, allowing the silence between us to speak. "It's rare," I said gently, "to feel this comfortable with someone." He nodded, not quickly, not impulsively. Thoughtfully. As though he understood exactly what I meant. And in that shared stillness, I recognized something important. What existed between us was not impulsive attraction. Not fleeting curiosity. It was something steadier, built on listening presence, on mutual respect. Trust had slipped in quietly, almost unnoticed. As I watched him standing there beneath the fading sky, I sensed that this was not a finished moment, but the beginning of something unfolding. Neither of us had planned it, neither of us had chased it. Yet both of us, in our own cautious ways, seemed willing to see where it might lead. The day ended not with fireworks, but with a gentle fullness. A quiet contentment that lingered long after he walked down the garden path and disappeared beyond the gate. I understood then that the strongest people are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who arrive without spectacle. Who hold space without trying to control it. Who make you feel visible without ever placing you under a spotlight. And somehow, without fully knowing when it had happened, I realized Michael was exactly that kind of strong. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted inside me. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing in my routine had changed on the surface. But the way I noticed him did. A brief message confirming his arrival carried more weight than it should have. The way his eyes searched instinctively for mine, when he stepped into a room felt intentional, even if it wasn't. The smallest exchanges seemed threaded with quiet meaning. I found myself anticipating his presence. Not just for conversation, not merely for help in the garden, but for the calm that seemed to settle over me when he was near. As if my thoughts aligned more easily. As if the background noise of life softened at the edges. It startled me, how quickly comfort can become something you crave. That morning, I stepped outside earlier than usual, telling myself I wanted to check on the roses before the sun grew too strong. The air was crisp, tinged with dew. The garden felt expectant. Suspended in that delicate space between night and day. And if I'm honest with myself, I wasn't just waiting for the sunlight. I was waiting for him. I wandered through the garden, checking the hydrangeas, my fingers brushing over the dew-specked leaves, almost expecting him to appear around the bend in the driveway. And, as if summoned by my anticipation, he did, effortless calm, yet somehow illuminating the crisp morning air with that quiet warmth of his presence. "Good morning, Mary," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a familiarity that made the sun feel gentler. "Good morning, Michael," I replied, feeling a little breathless without knowing why. "I was just checking the garden, want to see the progress." He nodded, and together we moved through the rows of blooms. Our steps fell into an easy rhythm. As if the garden had always been a shared space and we had always known how to inhabit it together. The scent of fresh petals filled the air, roses, hydrangeas, early jasmine, and I felt a quiet exhilaration in having someone beside me who noticed, who appreciated the subtle beauty of it all. Then, without warning, I ran into a struggle. A large overgrown bush had resisted my efforts all morning. I bent, hands gripping stubborn branches, straining against awkward angles and unexpected weight. My own determination faltered, and frustration rose quietly in my chest. Before I could call out, Michael was there. Kneeling beside me, he lifted the bulk of the bush with a gentle strength that seemed effortless, placing it exactly where it belonged. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice carrying a soft admiration I hadn't intended. "You're welcome," he said, his tone calm, sincere. "You don't have to struggle alone, Mary. Sometimes it's easier with help." There it was again, the kind of strength that didn't need recognition, that didn't demand attention. The quiet kind that mattered most because it simply existed when it was needed. A warmth settled in my chest, gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of being fully seen. We continued working in companionable silence, side by side. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow across the garden, illuminating petals and leaves alike. Bees hummed lazily between blooms, the air alive with the soft pulse of life. And all the while Michael's presence grounded me. Steady, protective, somehow entirely comforting, yet still stirring a strange, unspoken curiosity about how someone so quietly strong could make the world feel simultaneously safe and thrilling. And the distant calls of birds weaving through the warm air. I found myself watching him more closely than I realized. The way his hands moved, steady, deliberate, confident, caught my attention. Every motion seemed measured, purposeful, yet infused with an unexpected care. And I began to understand that this attentiveness wasn't limited to the garden alone. It was in how he carried himself, how he listened, how he responded to the rhythm of the world around him and to me. At one point, we paused, leaning on our tools, breathing in the sun-warmed air. The silence that settled between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken meaning. I felt a flutter inside me, an unexpected, nervous excitement that seemed almost youthful. At 66, I wasn't accustomed to such stirrings, yet here I was, drawn in by a man whose quiet strength was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Michael's gaze met mine, calm yet intense, holding a mixture of acknowledgement and restraint. He wasn't forward. He didn't need to be. But there was a subtle electricity there. A quiet depth that made my pulse quicken without warning. In that shared glance, I sensed that what existed between us had grown beyond simple acquaintance. There was a mutual recognition of something deeper, a curiosity that words could barely touch. Later, as we turned our attention to trimming a small tree, I misjudged a low branch and nearly stumbled. His hand was there instantly, steadying me. Firm yet gentle, the touch carried reassurance and protection. A silent promise that strength could coexist with tenderness. I looked up at him, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to the two of us alone, suspended in the sun-dappled garden. "You're careful," I said, my voice catching slightly, aware of the closeness this simple gesture had created. He smiled softly, a subtle curve that spoke more than words. "I always am when it matters," he replied. The afternoon stretched lazily onward. Each shared task, each quiet exchange, each subtle glance layered itself into the connection between us, weaving a web of understanding and trust. With every passing minute, the garden felt less like a place I tended alone, and more like a space we occupied together, attuned to each other's presence in ways neither of us needed to speak aloud. And in that gentle unfolding, I realized just how rare and profound such a connection could be, a discovery that felt at once comforting, exhilarating, and utterly unexpected. It wasn't about romance in the flashy, dramatic sense. It was quieter than that, about understanding, mutual respect, and the slow, steady building of trust. And in the process, I realized I was learning something about myself, too, about my capacity to let someone in, to feel fully, to embrace the subtle intimacies that life sometimes offers, even late in life. By the time the sun had begun its gentle descent, painting the garden in rich shades of gold, Michael and I were sitting on the edge of a flower bed, our tools set aside, breathing a little heavily from the work but lighter in spirit. There was laughter, soft and unforced, as we recounted small mishaps from the day. The stubborn branches, the misplaced clippings, but beneath that laughter lay a shared stillness. A recognition that the afternoon had been quietly significant. "I don't often do this," I said finally, my voice low. Spend time with someone like this, it's rare. Michael's eyes met mine, steady, thoughtful, and entirely present. I know, he said simply. And yet here we are. The words lingered between us, unspoken yet fully understood. There was no need for declarations, no rush to label or define. What mattered was the acknowledgement of what had unfolded, the significance of shared presence, the unspoken intensity of connection, and the quiet, unwavering strength that had drawn me to him from the very first ride. As we parted that evening, I carried with me a new sense of anticipation. Not for grand gestures, not for dramatic revelations, but for the slow unfolding of something real. Something nurtured by care, patience, and the rare kind of strength Michael possessed, strong in body, yes, but even more so in spirit. The next day, I found myself thinking about him more than I expected. Small gestures, the way he would confirm a time to arrive, the subtle glance when entering a room, carried weight. I realized that I was looking forward to these moments, not just for conversation, or for his quiet steadiness, but for the sense of calm, of safety, of being genuinely seen that accompanied his presence. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that what had begun as a simple ride, a casual afternoon in the garden, was quietly transforming into something far more meaningful. A connection that could grow slowly, steadily, and profoundly, nurtured by the rare strength and care that Michael carried with him, every day, without ever needing to show off. That morning, I awoke with a curious blend of anticipation and calm, a feeling I couldn't quite name, yet one that whispered the day would be different. The rhythm between Michael and me had shifted subtly over the past few days, settling into something steady, quiet, and unspoken. It was as if the world outside the garden could pause, allowing us to inhabit the space we begun to share without rush or expectation. When Michael arrived, he carried with him the same understated presence that always seemed to center me, that quiet gravity that made me feel fully seen. In his hands, he held a small basket of freshly cut herbs and blooms, their green and soft colors spilling gently over the edges. He placed it on the kitchen counter with a care so simple, yet so intimate, that my chest warmed before he even spoke. "I thought these might brighten the morning," he said, voice soft with just the hint of a smile touching his eyes. "They do," I replied, my words barely above a whisper, though my heart responded loudly. "Thank you." We spent the morning moving through the garden together, pruning, weeding, planting, the hours slipping past like water over smooth stones. Laughter arose easily, soft and unforced, and between the laughter, there was that comfortable silence only possible between people who had begun to understand each other in ways words could not capture. Michael's strength, both quiet and certain, lingered at my side, a reassurance that steadied without crowding, that supported without asserting. It was a strength that felt protective yet gentle, a kind of presence that made it safe for me to be fully myself. At one point, we lifted a heavy planter together. Our hands met briefly, brushing against each other, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. This time, it was no longer awkward or startling, it felt inevitable, natural. In that simple touch, I realized how much had quietly grown over the past few days. A connection delicate, yet solid, rooted in trust, in mutual respect, in admiration that needed no words to define it. The sun had begun to soften, spilling its golden light over the garden, painting shadows along the paths and petals alike. The warmth settled around us, mingling with the quiet intimacy of our shared space. I noticed the way Michael's gaze lingered on small details, the curve of a branch, the way sunlight caught the leaves, attentive, careful, aware of the world and of me in it. Each glance, each subtle motion, carried a significance that words would never capture. Time seemed to bend in those hours. The world beyond the garden felt distant, unimportant, as if the garden itself had created its own universe, one that only we could occupy. And in that universe, something unspoken threaded between us. An unhurried understanding, a promise of presence, and the stirring awareness that this quiet, unassuming bond was growing into something meaningful, something rare. The afternoon stretched lazily on, each task, each smile, each fleeting touch adding to the subtle but undeniable tension. The soft pull of a connection neither of us fully named, but both recognized. And I knew, without needing to articulate it, that what had begun as simple days in the garden, small gestures, shared labor, and laughter, was evolving into something profound. Something that lingered in the chest and in the mind long after the work was done. We paused near a small bench tucked beneath a flowering tree. Michael leaned back slightly, wiping the sweat from his brow, and I couldn't help but notice how effortless he made even the hardest task seem. There was no flourish, no need for praise, just the quiet assurance of someone who knew his own strength and willed it only when it mattered. "Mary," he said suddenly, his voice low and gentle, "I enjoy this more than I can say. Not just the work or the garden, it's the time with you. Being here like this." A lump formed in my throat, not from sadness, but from the weight of recognition. The kind that quietly settles over you when you realize someone has touched more than just the surface of your life. "I feel the same," I admitted softly. "I haven't felt this connected in a long time." For a while, we sat there together in silence, letting the golden afternoon light filter through the leaves, dappled on the bench and across the garden path. There was no rush, no expectation. Only the presence of two people who had begun to understand each other on a level far deeper than appearances or polite conversation could capture. The world beyond the garden felt distant, irrelevant. Later, as we pushed a wheelbarrow back toward the shed, Michael paused mid-step and turned toward me. His gaze was calm, thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice steady, "strength isn't just about lifting or carrying heavy things. It's about being there when it matters, about making space for someone else, and knowing when to act, and when to wait." I nodded slowly, the meaning sinking in fully. That was the kind of strength he had always shown me. The strength that never demanded attention, never sought validation. Quiet. Steady. Protective. Reassuring. In that realization, a deep sense of gratitude rose within me, not just for him, but for the subtle lessons he had imparted. About trust, about connection, about intimacy measured in moments of shared effort, shared presence, and shared silence. The sun began its slow descent, spilling gold and violet across the sky, illuminating the garden in that fleeting, perfect light. Shadows stretched along the paths, intertwining with the glowing petals of flowers we had tended together. I felt the pulse of the day settle inside me, a warmth that lingered, carrying both the weight of recognition and the lightness of something quietly extraordinary unfolding between us. And in that moment, I understood. This connection, delicate yet undeniable, was more than a coincidence. It was a revelation. A gentle, steady force that had quietly entered my life, and I was ready to see where it might lead. Michael and I stood side by side, surveying the garden bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon. The flowers seemed almost alive, vibrant and carefully tended, mirroring, in a quiet way, the bond had grown between us over these past few days. "I'm glad we did this," I said softly, my eyes meeting his. "So am I," he replied, his voice carrying a gentle warmth, steady and reassuring. "More than I thought I would be." There was no need for further words. Between us, a quiet acknowledgement passed, an understanding that this connection was rare, delicate, and worth nurturing. It was a bond that didn't need flourish or declaration to prove itself. The subtle touches, the shared silences, the unspoken respect and care, all of it was enough. As he gathered his tools and prepared to leave, a wave of reflection washed over me. I realized that these days had been more than simple companionship. They had been a journey of discovery, about myself, about trust, about the unexpected ways human connection can arrive and root itself even in later life. Michael had taught me something profound. That true strength isn't loud or showy. It is gentle, it is steady. It is an emotional presence that reassures, steadies, and makes space for others to be themselves. That presence, quiet, unwavering, and attentive, was more powerful than anything I had encountered in years. When he finally drove away, I lingered at the garden gate, watching the dust of the road settle behind him. I felt a strange mixture of longing and gratitude. This wasn't an ending. Not at all, it was a beginning. A beginning built on trust, on reconnection that had emerged slowly, quietly, and unmistakably between us. Turning back to the garden, I let my gaze linger over the flowers, their petals catching the twilight. A rare sense of peace settled over me, one I hadn't known in years. In the simplicity of these shared moments, the unexpected ride, the afternoon tea, the quiet companionship of someone strong yet unobtrusive, I had discovered something that would stay with me long after the moment had passed. It wasn't about romance, it wasn't about drama, it was about discovery, about recognition, about the profound beauty of being truly seen and understood. And in that garden, beneath the soft fading light, I knew I had found something rare, meaningful, and unforgettable, a quiet bond built not on spectacle, but on strength, care, and connection that resonates long after the world moves on.